A very wise man. We stated a couple of times already that we gain wisdom in our lives through various channels. And one of the ways we gain wisdom is from trial and error, from experience. We sometimes are hard-headed, we know better, but we do things, and we have to learn a lesson from that. And from time to time, that lesson is a hard lesson to learn. But then a better way of gaining knowledge that we've stated, and it's really the reason we're studying from the book of Proverbs, a better way of gaining knowledge is to learn from the experiences of others. To learn from those who perhaps have made some mistakes in their lives. Maybe to learn from someone who learned how to do it the right way the first time. But nonetheless, to learn from them, to gain experience from them so that we can avoid making mistakes in our own lives. And Solomon, in the book of Proverbs, wants to share an experience. He wants to share experiences perhaps that he's gained through living life, perhaps that he's gained through making mistakes. And he wants to share that wisdom with people that he describes in this book as his sons. There is a drip up here. If you see that, and I'm distracted by it, there's a drip. It's dripping from the ceiling. It's landing right here. The second time, and it's already getting on my nerves, so bear with me. Anybody got a bucket I can set right here, by the way? He wants to share this wisdom, and he's giving this wisdom to his children, to his sons. And if you look in Proverbs chapter 1 and verse 8, he says, "Hear, my son, your father's wisdom, your father's instruction." He says something very similar in verse 1 of chapter 2. "My son, receive my words and treasure up my commandments for you." And then he says the same thing in chapter 3, I think in chapter 4 and 5. At the beginning of every one of these chapters, he makes some kind of reference about giving wisdom and his son receiving instruction. And from time to time, Solomon warns about things in Proverbs. That's one way that parents teach their children, is they warn them about problems. We noticed last week that he warned about friends that you make. And tonight he goes in very quickly in Proverbs chapter 1 and chapter 2, and he broaches a topic that has really wrecked so many people's lives that I want us to give some attention to this evening. In Proverbs chapter 2, you can see in the reading from just a moment ago, Solomon is saying, "Listen to me and listen to God." And he says, "You'll be delivered from the forbidden woman, from the adulteress and her smooth words." He goes on to further describe the adulteress in verses 17, 18, and 19 there in chapter 2. One translation states that this forbidden woman is a strange woman. And then she is described as a sexually loose woman. And so the name of our lesson tonight is simply Wisdom About Adultery. But the truth of the matter is, these are warnings about adultery. And I want you to understand, and I especially want to say this for our young people's sake, I want us to understand that what we're talking about tonight is the danger of sexual sin. I mean, we're going to use the term adultery. It's a little bit more of a specific term. It's more of a specific sin. But there is the idea of sexual sin in the Bible that is often translated as immorality. Sometimes in certain translations it's translated as fornication. It's more of an umbrella term. So we're talking about sexual sin. Really. In verse 9, Jesus allows it to be the one exception for divorce and remarriage. Now, perhaps a lesson like this wouldn't be sufficient without sharing some statistics with you. And I want to do that for just a moment. Statistics about sexual sin are really hard to get a good impression of because the ranges vary so much in how people answer questions about this. I think they're very wide-ranging for the same reason that the sins exist in the first place, and that is people aren't always honest. They aren't always honest about their lives. They aren't always honest about perhaps the mistakes they've made with their lives, and perhaps some of the sins they're currently committing. So that being the case, when there are statistics about sexual sin, you have these wide ranges. But having said that, studies suggest that on the low end, 15 to 25% of married people. So when we're talking about adultery, specifically we're talking about sexual relations between at least one person who's married. On the low end, 15 to 25% of married people, statistics suggest, will commit adultery. That's on the low end. On the high end, the number goes as high as 60%, from 40 to 60%. Like I said, there's a wide range there, probably because people aren't always on the up and up about admitting what has happened. Men, according to these studies, are typically more likely to be involved in adultery. But although women are statistically not as likely, still the ranges indicate that just too many have succumbed to this sin. I want to make sure that I share the good news with you about this. When a person commits sin, forgiveness is available. We understand that, and we need to remind people of that. The good news is there are countless couples who have even recovered from sin entering into their marriage. That can only happen, though, if the one who commits adultery is willing to repent, and the one who is the innocent one in that regard is willing to forgive. But the good news is it can happen. It happens quite frequently, probably more than you can even imagine. But I've got to share the reality of this with you as well. The reality of this is the bad news is for every example of one couple who has overcome this, there are numerous couples whose marriages ended because of sexual sin. And so, again, I want to be honest with you. I want to be forthright with you. This is something that's very serious. Yes, forgiveness is available. All sins can be forgiven. There are certain consequences that are attached to adultery, as we mentioned from Matthew 19 and verse 9, that we have to be aware of, we have to teach, and we have to remind people of. But the good news is when sin has been committed, it can be forgiven. The bad news is often, though, this particular sin causes a lot of difficulty in people's lives, not just during the time when that sin is committed, but the consequences of that can be life-lasting. That's why it's such an important thing for us to discuss. I was preaching about adultery in a gospel meeting one time, and it was a few weeks after I got home from that meeting that I got a little note in the mail. And it was from a person whose life had been affected by this sin. And they mentioned, and the reason I mentioned just what I mentioned a moment ago, they mentioned that when we talk about adultery, we need to talk about both sides of it. We need to talk about it in terms of how there is sin that's committed, but there are also innocent bystanders who get caught up in this. And it affects innocent spouses. It obviously affects homes. It affects children. And so tonight, I think our lesson, the words of our title are very appropriate when we consider some biblical wisdom about this sin. And remember, as we said before, this is a warning. This is a warning about adultery. There are three things I want to bring to your attention from over in chapter 5 of the book of Proverbs. So if you will turn over a couple of pages, there is quite a good section, a long section in Proverbs chapter 5 that is dedicated to this very issue. And that's a little uncommon, by the way, in the book of Proverbs. I've mentioned this before. Often the Proverbs are just, one topic, new topic, right on top of another. But here you've got a long section that's really dealing with one thing. And so I wanted to look at it tonight from a textual point of view. And there are really three things that I want to bring to your attention in the next few minutes. The first thing we want to talk about is the promise of adultery. And there are two promises I want to mention here that are involved in this. The first is what we might call the false promise. If you look at Proverbs chapter 5 and verse 3, it says, "For the lips of a forbidden woman drip honey. Her speech is smoother than oil." Over in chapter 2, just a moment ago, we read how the adulterer will often use smooth words. And so the idea here is there is a promise. One considering sexual sin might notice the enticement. And the message from the Bible is you're being enticed and you're being tricked. You're being deceived. John MacArthur makes this comment. He says, the first characteristic of sexual sin is deceit. Anytime sexual sin is considered, you need to recognize that the devil is trying to trick you. The devil is trying to deceive you. Remember that forbidden fruit is always tempting. Eve found that out, Genesis chapter 3 and verse 6. But also remember, forbidden fruit creates many jams. And if you don't believe that, ask someone whose life has been affected. If you succumb to this temptation, perhaps the part about she is as bitter as wormwood just kind of goes over our head, and we don't understand that. I did a little research about this. Wormwood is actually the wood from a shrub that if you taste the wood, it's extremely bitter. And this wood, this wormwood, was actually used in olden days as an antidote. to you about this. Many people whose lives and families have been torn apart because of adultery can attest to the mental health anguish that they suffer with because of the consequences of this sin. It's part of the price of adultery. It will cost you some of your mental health. And then he says also it will cost you your reputation. Look in verse 14 of chapter 5. He says, I am at the brink of utter ruin in the assembled congregation. I think he's talking about the reputation that all of us enjoy. You know, one of the great gifts you're given in life is you're given a blank slate. And it's up to you to write your story. It's up to you to write your history. It's up to you to present how others will view you. And of course, this starts at a very young age, but it progressively gets more and more serious, we might say, as we get older, as we reach the age of accountability, what we start doing with our lives, the decisions that we start making, as we go through our teen years, as we go through our adult years, as we grow older. And we're writing a story. We really are. And other people are going to be able to read that story. And anytime we commit sin, there are consequences. No matter what the sin is, there are consequences. It will chip away, if you will, at the story that you're writing. And of course, the wise man understands that our reputation will be seriously harmed when adultery is committed. If you go over to chapter 6 in verse 27, read a few verses with me, and he really brings this to light when he says, can a man carry fire next to his chest and his clothes not be burned? He's talking about consequences of doing something here. I mean, can you pick up fire and not be burned? We all know the answer to that question. He brings it up here. And he says, or can one walk on hot coals and his feet not be scorched? So is he who goes to his neighbor's wife. So he's talking specifically about adultery here. So he that goes to his neighbor's wife, none who touches her will go unpunished. People do not despise a thief if he steals to satisfy his appetite when he's hungry. But if he's caught, he will pay sevenfold. He will give all the goods of his house. It's interesting that he says, you know, even if somebody steals something, but they do that because they're hungry, it's like society might understand. There will be consequences for doing that, he admits, but society might understand. But he says here, he who commits adultery lacks sense, verse 32. He who does it destroys himself. Wounds and dishonor will he get, and his disgrace will not be wiped away. I mean, I don't know how else you could understand that than understanding that he's talking about your reputation will suffer. And so there is a price to pay when adultery is committed. As I mentioned before, even in the case of one who perhaps is the innocent party in this regard, there are consequences, difficult consequences that it brings to one's life. I'm not talking about sin consequences, but emotional consequences, pain, family problems, and the like. The last thing that I want to bring to your attention that Solomon brings to our attention is what we might call the prevention of adultery. You know, any good lesson will analyze the problem, will discuss the issue, but then it will hopefully give some ways to avoid or prevent this from happening in our lives. I would remind you, with all the evidence that's presented in the Old Testament about this sin, all the evidence in the New Testament that's given about the consequences of this sin, I think it would be sufficient just to say the prevention of adultery is simply don't do it. Just don't. Don't ever commit the sin. But Solomon gives us some practical ways to avoid committing this sin. Stay home. Stay home. Stay home with your wife. Look at verses 15 and 16. Drink water from your own cistern, flowing water from your own. Verses 18, 19, and 20, it's almost like we've moved over into the book of Song of Solomon here with some of these words. Let your fountain be blessed and rejoice in the wife of your youth, a lovely deer, a graceful doe. Let her breasts fill you at all times with delight. Be intoxicated always in her love. Why should you be intoxicated, my son, with a forbidden woman and embrace the bosom of an adulteress? In other words, just like we've said in the previous 2 points, stay at home, stay away from others, and enjoy the relationship that God allows you to have with your own wife. And then the final thing, and it's perhaps could be said first and foremost in this regard, to prevent adultery, just stay faithful to your God. The chapter closes like this, for a man's ways are before the eyes of the Lord, and he ponders all his paths. The iniquities of the wicked ensnare him. He is held fast in the cords of his sin. He dies for lack of discipline, and because of his great folly, he is led astray. I think the warning here is not only stay faithful to your God, but be reminded that when our lives stray away from God's path, when our lives stray over into sin, we may fool some people. You may fool your spouse. You may fool your family. You may fool your friends. You may even fool some people at church. But you're not going to fool God. For a man's ways, he says, are before the eyes of the Lord. And that's just a powerful reminder to stay faithful to our God, to keep our relationship right with Him, to keep our relationship faithful with Him. Wisdom about adultery, really warnings about adultery is what we've seen tonight. Remember, the promise of adultery is there. There's a false promise, but the real promise is that it's like a double-edged sword. It's like wormwood. It's bitter. The price of adultery, he went further with that, giving us several things that adultery will cost us. And then these are practical words to avoid this sin in our lives, as we've noticed at the end in the prevention of adultery. Most important relationship that anybody can have, first and foremost, is the relationship they have with their God. We closed just a moment ago by noticing those last 2 or 3 verses, how God knows us. He knows us. He knows what we do. He knows our thoughts. He knows our actions. And the most important relationship that we can have is to have a right relationship with Him. And when we get that right, and when we stay faithful in that relationship, when we walk in the light after we become a Christian, then it's amazing how all other aspects of our life will fall into place. Have you ever noticed that? Have you ever observed that? It's not rocket science. It's really just simple, true, biblical teaching. When we live right, when we follow God's plan for our lives, it's amazing how much simpler our lives can really be. And so I want to give you the opportunity tonight, as we always do at the close of our lesson, to give anyone that needs to respond to the invitation the opportunity. If your relationship is not right with God, here's the great opportunity you have right now. It may be the only time you'll ever have again to respond to the Lord. If you're not a Christian, become a Christian by obeying the gospel, putting your faith in the Lord, repenting of your sins, confessing His name before men, being baptized for the forgiveness of your sins. And if then you've done that, and yet your relationship with God is not what it needs to be, and you need to come back to Him and ask His forgiveness for sins, and to ask your church family to support you, to pray with you, and to help you, that is why we offer this invitation. If you need to respond, we want to give you that opportunity right now. Right now, as together we stand and as we sing.